Lower Saxony, Germany, April 1945. The dawn came thin and colorless, dragging a ghost of fog through the birch groves. Dew clung to every blade of grass, magnifying the remnants of the night's frost into sparks of silver. The earth smelled of cold clay and cordite, both the scent of life and the smell of what remained after life had been spent. The war was collapsing into silence out here, into the long sigh that comes before surrender, yet every soldier on both sides still moved as if any hedge or barn door could erupt with rifle fire. A column of American infantry, mud-browned and gray-eyed, veterans of too many frozen mornings, picked its cautious way along a dirt lane north of Chell. Their boots made soft, sucking sounds as they left perfect negatives in the soil. At their head, Sergeant Robert Woods raised a gloved fist. The signal rippled backward down the line until everyone froze. Something had stirred in the hedgerow 50 yards ahead. The sound was not quite stealthy, not the deliberate rustle of seasoned soldiers, more like a heartbeat trying to hide inside a bushel of leaves. Private Sam Kelleher crouched, peering through mist. He saw movement-rounded helmets, awkwardly tilted, bobbing slightly above the hedge. The light caught on them like dull pewter. "They're dug in," someone whispered. Another voice muttered, "Could be SS, could be farmers." Nobody truly believed in farmers anymore. Then, cutting the haze, came a shout in broken, rehearsed German. Orders to stand fast, invoke the oath of loyalty to the Führer. The words cracked with the shrillness of youth. When figures finally emerged, they seemed absurdly small inside their uniforms. Boys, barely taller than the rifles trembling in their hands. One's tunic hung from shoulders that hadn't yet squared into adulthood. Another still had milk on his upper lip. At least that's how it looked when Woods later tried to explain it. Some wore mismatched boots. One clutched a loaf of bread in the same hand as his weapon, too hungry to let go. The Americans looked at each other behind their rifles. They had learned to resist sympathy. It was a shortcut to dying, but this was not in the manual. Kelleher, the farm boy from Illinois, murmured, "Hell, they're just kids." The sentence pierced the morning deeper than a gunshot. The German lieutenant himself, maybe 20, flinched as the interpreter repeated the word across the fog, "Kinder." For a second he seemed unsure if it was insult or mercy. His men hesitated, fingers twitching near triggers, trying to fit the image of American monsters, with these mud-spattered strangers calling them children. A crow rose, startled, from a branch between them. Its wingbeats shattered the frozen tableau. One boy dropped his rifle. The metallic thud rang like a church bell in an empty town. Another followed, then another, faces pale, eyes stinging from smoke and sudden tears. Sergeant Wood stepped forward, rifle lowered, voice pitched low and steady. "Lay 'em down, boys. It's finished." The moment felt impossibly fragile, two lines of young soldiers staring into mirrors of themselves, the promise of fear cracking open into something human. Fog wrapped both sides together, erasing the distinction of uniform color until only shapes remained. Weary men and bewildered boys, standing in the same cold light and realizing the war was older than any of them. That was the moment when language, propaganda, and obedience faltered, and empathy began to speak for the first time in months. By April 1945, Germany was no longer a country, so much as a scattering of smoking towns stitched together by fear and exhaustion. The Reich's banners still hung from official buildings, but the wind turned them into gray rags. Villages once proud of tidy gardens now smelled of scorched earth, cooking smoke, and hunger. Fresh graves rose behind every farmhouse, roofs slanted where bombs had clipped them. In the north of Lower Saxony, life contracted into routine survival. Farmers bartered potatoes for candles, mothers melted soap for washing children who flinched at the sound of any engine. Cattle were slaughtered not for market, but to stop them from starving on trampled pasture. The front line was said to be miles away one morning, and at the doorstep by evening, depending on whose rumor you believed. At the edges of this crumbling landscape, the Nazi apparatus kept working like a ghost engine, fuel running out, yet pistons still pounding. Propaganda stations broadcast desperate pledges of final victory. Every boy a soldier, every girl a nurse. Posters showed smiling youths in spotless uniforms, rifles raised toward a dawn that would never arrive. In classrooms and church basements, the Hitler Jugend drilled with wooden rods, chanting vows they scarcely understood. The teachers told them it was glory. The truth was depletion. Real soldiers were gone, dead, wounded, or captured. All that remained were children, and the illusions sculpted around them. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend embodied that illusion's last breath. Formed 2 years earlier from fanatic youth volunteers, it had been celebrated as the regime's most pure division. Reality, by 45, looked considerably less cinematic. Half-trained replacements recruited from schools, some as young as 13, wearing helmets too heavy for their necks. Their commanders, veterans promoted far too young, carried equal parts faith and terror. They were told surrender meant betrayal of family and fatherland. More persuasive than any sermon was the fear of what Allied soldiers would do to them, stories that painted the Americans as ravenous beasts. Across the opposite channel of mud and mistrust, the Americans were equally weary. Months of winter fighting from Normandy to the Ardennes had sanded them down to their bones. Their laughter was dry, their cigarettes automatic. They moved with the momentum of habit, not enthusiasm. Some kept letters folded in helmet linings, precious oaths that the war would not change them beyond recognition. Yet nothing truly shields a mind from 4 years of carnage. They had seen death packaged every way possible: noble, meaningless, accidental, heroic. Flares in night skies, frozen boots, and the faint mechanical ticking of watches on the wrists of the dead. The unit trudging toward Celle on that gray morning belonged to the 30th Infantry Division, the Old Hickory. Experienced, disciplined, cautious. Few within it had illusions left. They expected every encounter to end in violence, every German in a gray uniform to fight until the last shot. As they advanced, the landscape around them whispered contradiction. Roads littered with abandoned wagons, bicycles chained to fence posts, children's shoes in the mud. These details unsettled men more than any sniper did. It meant the enemy's myth of endless strength was dissolving. There was no triumph in that knowledge, only unease, as if witnessing the death of a nation rather than a foe. The American convoy creaked past farmyards where the hens still roosted out of instinct, through lanes with apple trees just beginning to show white buds. The scent of spring mixed obscenely with the odor of burned oil. They were marching toward victory, but victory looked too much like desolation to celebrate. Somewhere ahead of them, down that same dirt road, waited the remnants of the youth company, a dozen teenagers clutching rifles. They barely knew how to fire. For days they had heard artillery patterns shifting westward, the steady growl of Allied armor pushing through neighboring villages. Their officer, Lieutenant Franz Rehm, carried a single objective: delay the Americans long enough for civilians to escape. He slept perhaps an hour at a time, his belief swinging between duty and an unspoken wish to be captured before more blood fell on his hands. He tried to maintain appearance, boots polished, collar buttoned, but his platoon looked more like a displaced class trip than a military unit. Some had never fired beyond training ranges. They sang songs under their breath to drown the thunder of tanks. They carved initials on rifle stocks because carving them on tree trunks suddenly felt too permanent. In this shrinking pocket of hope and fear, propaganda still echoed louder than logic. Their radio had gone silent after one last command: stand and fight to the end. Most believed rescue would come a new miracle weapon, an unseen turn of fortune. Few realized the war was already finished beyond redemption. So the stage was set. Weary professionals approaching from the west, indoctrinated adolescents waiting in fog, each convinced the other would destroy them. Between them lay not just a field, but the final collapse of illusion into empathy. The standoff that dawn had frozen both sides into statues. Even the birds seemed to hesitate, deciding whether sound itself was safe. Then the smallest movement, an American shifting his weight, a German tightening his jaw, brought the tableau flickering back to life. Lieutenant Franz Rehm knew he was beaten before his mind admitted it. The Americans' rifles were steady, disciplined. His own boy's hands shook too openly. He'd been trained to meet death with posture, but now posture meant little. The two forces watched each other through gray light, as if trying to remember which one should play the enemy. When Rehm finally spoke, his voice had none of the authority he hoped for. "Don't fire," he told them, and the words sounded like a confession. One boy, nicknamed Otto by the others, was 14. He had slipped his school exercise book inside his tunic to protect his chest. The edges of paper poked out near his collar. He still imagined his duty as a school competition courage measured in points. Otto's eyes darted between his officer and the strangers in dull green uniforms across the field, every heartbeat pulsing with the question of whether he would die a hero or a fool. The Americans, too, were undecided about what this was. They had fought Waffen-SS, diehards at Aachen men who shot medics and surrendered only when incinerated. Now they were staring at boys younger than their own brothers. A cognitive dissonance settled like extra fog, dense and unrelenting. Woods called out first, "You can walk out alive, boys." His tone wasn't victory or threat, just tired humanity wearing a uniform. A long pause followed. Then Rehm lifted his arm slowly, as if moving through water. "We surrender," he said in German, the word thin and almost unbelievable in his own mouth. It carried across the quiet like the crack of brittle glass. Rifles clattered down, one by one, until the hedge became just a line of discarded metal. The Americans advanced carefully, weapons still wary, but no shots came. Instead of battle, there was the rustle of young bodies shivering in sudden relief. Face to face now, they looked less like two armies than two exhausted families meeting after a long separation. Private Kelleher noticed how small their boots were, some taken from dead men, stuffed with straw. Several Germans stared at his unit patch, the blue Old Hickory, unsure what it meant. He tried a smile. "You're safe now, kids," he said. His own voice startled him, how easily that word came. The translator repeated it, Kinder. The syllables ricocheted through the group softly, almost tenderly. The youngest German, still chewing back fear, whispered, "They call us children?" The lieutenant confirmed with a nod, eyes unfocused somewhere beyond defeat. Until this moment, all of them had known themselves only as soldiers or propagandist symbols, never again as children. The reminder came like a wound they hadn't realized they carried. That evening, the prisoners were taken to a nearby barn, commandeered as a field detention point. The building smelled of hay and diesel. Rain drummed against the tin roof while lanterns painted amber pools across damp straw. The Americans offered tin cups of coffee. Superstition kept the boys still at first. Rumors had said Allied soldiers poisoned prisoners, shot them for fun, but hunger and disbelief won. Otto took the first sip and flinched. The bitter taste was nothing like the sweet drinks of his youth, yet its warmth spread through the chill, numbing his fingers. A medic entered with gauze and iodine. He worked on a boy's grazed wrist, humming under his breath. "Hold still, son," he murmured. The title son, ordinary, automatic, made the boy's mouth quiver. No one had called him that since conscription day. Tears weren't heroic, yet they came unstoppable. Around him others watched in silence, realizing the officer wasn't scolding the medic, but standing with head slightly bowed. In another corner, Kelleher passed out chocolate from his ration pack. The foil wrappers gleamed like treasures. The prisoners stared at them until the corporal exaggerated a bite from his own bar, grinning to prove it he's harmless. Laughter short, uncertain, trickled through the barn. The war's grandest ideologies evaporated under the smell of cocoa and damp straw. By midnight the rain had eased, some prisoners slept, a few spoke in hushed German that the Americans half understood. One asked the interpreter, "Do you have children too?" Woods answered from across the room, "Yeah." He's 12, thinks he's tough. The silence afterward was not discomfort but shared comprehension, recognition of parallel lives once separated by flags. Outside the barn, artillery muffled far away like thunder beyond mountains. Inside, breath mingled with lantern smoke. No one dared name it peace. Still, it felt closer than anyone remembered. When dawn came, gray light slanted through broken boards, illuminating rifles stacked in the corner like relics of a recently departed belief system. The boys woke slowly, blinking as if uncertain that mercy had survived the night. For the Americans as well, something irreversible had shifted. They would carry the image of those tear-streaked faces much longer than the memory of any firefight. Violence had become routine, but kindness still had the power to wound. Each soldier felt somewhere within himself the subtle ache of that word, kids, echoing as both grace and accusation. By the second morning, the war in that valley seemed to have run out of breath. The fog had burned off, leaving damp sunlight glinting on puddles and the metal skins of jeeps. When the trucks from division headquarters arrived to collect the German prisoners, the Americans gathered them gently, almost reluctantly, as if afraid to disturb a fragile ceasefire made of simple understanding. The boys climbed aboard the open truck beds with the slow coordination of the exhausted. Helmets hung from their fingertips. One handed up the corner of a folded map, pointing west. "England?" he asked. The driver shook his head. "Camp. Food. First." The boy half smiled as if that alone were blessing enough. Sergeant Woods watched them settle, their gray uniforms catching sunlight like dull pewter. He could not reconcile these hesitant faces with the uniform he'd once sworn to hate. They looked less like prisoners than like lost students at the wrong stop. Before the tailgate closed, the smallest one, Otto, the boy with the schoolbook under his tunic, lifted his hand in a hesitant wave. Woods answered without thinking, a simple lift of his fingers. That unmilitary gesture seemed to punctuate something larger than orders or surrender papers. The convoy jolted forward, tires sloshed through mud, scattering raindrops from nearby hedges. Blue April sky reflected off every puddle, doubling the brightness until the departing trucks looked momentarily luminous. Within minutes, they rounded a bend and vanished behind a screen of birches. The field fell quiet except for engines fading into distance and a lark trying experimental pieces of song. The Americans began to pack their gear. No one talked much. Kelleher crouched near the hedge where it had all begun, sifting through the impressions left in the mud child-sized footprints among rifle marks. He found one chocolate wrapper pressed flat and shiny gold in the sunlight. Without ceremony, he tucked it into his pocket. Later, he'd mail it home with a note that simply read, "Found peace for 5 minutes." At the prisoner collection point that afternoon, a Red Cross team met the convoy. Nurses in field gray coats performed quick medical checks, murmuring in courteous German. The boys tried to return the politeness, still afraid of doing something wrong. One nurse wrote in her notebook, "Many too young, all very polite, cry easily." When a harmonica player from the American Guard detachment offered a slow country tune, several prisoners leaned forward as though remembering how to breathe. The melody drifted across the camp, neither triumphant nor mournful, just human. In maps and memoirs, that day will barely earn a footnote. Yet, in its quiet way, it marked the moment when ideology yielded to empathy. No official announcement declared it, no commanders issued new doctrine. It happened only in looks exchanged, in unguarded words heard honestly for the first time. Historians later called the German collapse inevitable, but inevitability does not weep. People do. For Woods, the memory never lost its texture. Fog damp on skin, the sight of boys surrendering their weapons as if shedding a fever. Decades later, he still felt it in his palms, the delicate weight of rifles past, the tremor of trust returning to motionless fingers. As Europe stumbled from warfare into occupation, as headlines replaced atrocities with treaties, the echo of that word kids lingered quietly along the roads back to Hanover, to Hamburg, to peace. The propaganda that once divided them could not survive its sound. Language itself had chosen mercy. Snow would fall by the next winter, covering those fields in white silence. Beneath it, tin helmets and crumpled wrappers rusted together, humble fossils of recognition. The world moved on, but somewhere in that buried soil lived the moment when soldiers stopped being enemies long enough to remember what their mothers called them. Even amidst ruin, kindness can arrive without permission, and sometimes all it takes to end a war, if only for a breath, is the courage to see the other side as someone's child.